Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you, Ken?
Exceptionally well, Rory, except for a little bit of a cold. That's why you might notice the deep voice. But apart from that, raring to go, glad to be here. You've tuned in to episode 134 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast, and we have three great topics that we're going to be discussing today, starting off with an interesting one, which is personal limitations in person-centered therapy. Can we have limitations that would prevent us, I guess, working at the optimum level with our clients? And then second topic today is check-in with CPCAB, where, Rory, you spoke to Heather about giving and receiving feedback. Can you give us a taste of what to expect?
Yes, feedback, the breakfast of champions, Ken. And Heather talks about why having good quality feedback is absolutely essential in the arc of counselling training and how it develops therapists to be able to learn and grow and be more confident in their work.
Thank you very much. Looking forward to that one. And we'll be ending episode 134 by looking at theory in the therapy room. Is there a place for theory in the therapy room when we're there with a client? Can it hinder the process if we're thinking about the theory? So an interesting topic of discussion there. But starting off with personal limitations in person-centered therapy.
Yes, well, it's interesting. This came up in our Facebook page. And if you don't know about our Facebook page, if you go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor, you'll find our closed group. Knock on the door. Of course, we're going to let you in. Thousands of like-minded people like you interested in the world of counselling and psychotherapy. And someone posted about, are there personal limitations to person-centered therapy? And making a reference to a book called Against Therapy by a writer called Jeffrey Masson, or Jeffrey Masson as he's better known. And he wrote a book saying that person-centered therapy, people put on the core conditions, that it was just a kind of affect, and that how can anybody be consistently genuine in the therapy room? And it got me thinking about, if you really are a person-centered therapy, you need to believe in the whole process. And I wonder if there are situations where people are doing the courses, are doing person-centered therapy, but don't believe in the underlying philosophy, see it just as a theory to be applied to clients.
That's really interesting. It's an interesting topic that's come up, and it's a good topic if you're a student and you're studying, because this is kind of something that may be asked of you in some of your assignments. They ask for limitations, I guess, in person-centered therapy, but you can also relate that to self. And I know certainly, Rory, when I first went into practice, I studied as a person-centered therapist. And when I first went into practice as a placement counsellor during my training, I don't know that I fully bought in to the person-centered model at that time. I was developing, I was growing, and I needed to have that evidence, which certainly was by watching clients self-actualize in front of my eyes. And it was only then that I kind of went, okay, I can relax into this. I can just kind of let go and trust that those core conditions and the way of working, that way of being, as Carl Rogers put it, are indeed necessary and sufficient. And of course, person-centered therapy, as you point out from time to time, Rory, was the therapy of its time. There's been a lot of research that have come since then, a lot of new developments. So of course we need to be aware of what the new developments are. But I can see that there is a potential, if you haven't bought in, if you're putting it on, if you're pretending to be empathic or trying to be empathic, that it may hinder the process.
Indeed, and I think some people are more empathic than others. I think the reality is that some people are incredible empaths who can really just enter someone's frame of reference, and some people are less than that. In fact, I was watching a presentation by Professor Mick Cooper, and he said the research pointed out that women seem to be, the research that was carried out, more empathic than men. So I think it all relies on how much people believe in the theory. And I think it's really interesting that Rogers came from a religious background, where, of course, belief is a big part of any religious background. So, yes, it is an interesting discussion. It's one that is lively debated in in classrooms up and down the country, and I'm sure across the world, whether people are totally empathic and whether they can be the core conditions. So I think this wants to be discussed in classrooms, this.
Definitely. And on our Facebook group, as you pointed out, Rory, get in there and chat about this. Another facet of this that comes up often, certainly saw this as a tutor amongst the learners, is the question of, can I truly be non-judgmental? What happens if somebody comes in with a horrific presentation of something that they've done? How can I not judge that? And I think this really keys into what this is about. The question we're discussing is personal limitations in person-centered therapy. And I think the word there is personal limitations. It doesn't necessarily mean the person-centered therapy is limited. It's ourselves. How do we limit or hinder that process? And we are a process of how we grew up, the messaging we were given as a child, our religious upbringing, our sexuality, our gender, our family structure, what messaging came from that, the messaging that came from the society that we live in. And all of that needs to be taken into consideration. And I guess that's why therapy training is so long. You're looking at the bare minimum of 3.5 to 4 years of training, going out and practicing. And during that time, you'll be seeing your own personal therapist as well. And that's to take that stuff in there, because definitely you will be limiting the process in person-centered therapy if you're looking through a lens of judgment because of prejudices, prejudgments, prejudices that you hold maybe from your life growing up.
Indeed. And take heart, Rogers himself made reference to a time when he thought he couldn't be non-judgmental. Towards the end of his life, he travelled the world demonstrating person-centered therapy, and he went during, I think, the 1970s to South Africa, which at the time had apartheid, which actively discriminated against the black population. And he was doing a piece of therapy with someone who worked in the army, a white officer in the army who was actively, the army itself was actively, using apartheid to quell the indigenous population down. And Rogers himself said that he thought he might struggle offering unconditional positive regard to this person. And at the end of the interview, as Rogers called it, he called therapy sessions interviews, he said that he didn't think he'd done a very good job. But interestingly, the client said he thought he'd done a great job. So sometimes our own view of ourselves can get in the way of what the client is experiencing.
Wow. It's an interesting topic, and I know, Rory, you've made one of your super duper handouts, which is so valuable. They really are precious. Rory's made a super duper handout on limitations of person-centered therapy. Again, something that comes up in assignment questions all the time. You can get that for free. All you need to do is go to our website, which is counsellingtutor.com. Click on the podcast tab because it's linked to our podcast. Go to episode 134, which is today's episode, and you will find Rory's super duper handout along with all the show notes, kind of external links for the topics that we're discussing today. But an interesting topic, and definitely one that needs to be continued. And I guess one that when you write about it, just be honest and really look into self if you're writing about it in your journal, if you write about it in your assignment, because that's where the marks are derived from, just being honest and taking an honest look at self. And you know what? The next topic kind of keys into giving and receiving feedback, which I guess is an interesting topic in itself, Roy. This is check-in with our good friends at CPCAB. You spoke to Heather. What can we expect?
Well, Heather highlights the importance of good critical feedback, and I use the word critical in the way it should be offered, in that it's thoughtful, it's accurate, it has developmental points, and she discusses why it's so useful in the arc of training and how it can help develop students into competent and confident practitioners.
Without any further ado, let's dive into Check-In with CPCAB.
Check-In with CPCAB.
And we welcome back Heather, who's going to talk about really an integral part of the training journey, which is giving and receiving feedback.
Hello, Rory. Yes, I think it seems to be something that students get quite worried about, particularly in the early stages of their training, but it can last throughout all the levels. And giving feedback is usually done quite early on in, say, a level 2 course, and students get quite scared. And I've heard comments like, well, I can't give feedback, I don't know enough. And I always think, well, you're in a group of people who are all learning the same thing at the same time. So actually, you as the person giving the feedback, you do know just as much as the person that's performing in the role of helper or counsellor or whatever. So in that respect, actually, you are just as able to give feedback as anybody else. I think probably wrapped up with that, though, is some fear around receiving feedback and perceiving it as a criticism. And a lot of our learners are adults coming back into education who might have had quite negative experiences of school and being told off and criticised and punished. And somehow feedback gets tied up with all of that they don't want to hear something that they might perceive as negative. And so they then feel, well, giving feedback is going to be very hard, because how can they do that in a way that isn't perceived as being critical and punishing? So I think there's quite a lot in it. And in fact, as I'm saying all of that, it feels, there is quite a lot in this.
Yes, you've expanded on that very well, really, because in training groups there can be a tendency, I think, for people to be, and I'm going to mention my favourite idea again, transference, where you're transferred back emotionally into maybe being in education as a child, and feedback seen as something punitive or something humiliating, where actually it's developmental, and that's the place it should really come from, isn't it? When you're giving feedback, it should be developmental and able to help people see what they've done really well and look at what they may be able to improve on.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I think it might help sometimes to compare it to, say, having driving lessons. You know, if you sat next to your driving instructor and your instructor never said anything, well, you wouldn't learn very much. And actually, you might pull out at a junction and crash into another car. So you need your instructor to give you some helpful feedback, like you need to turn the wheel a little bit more to the left now, or you need to be looking left and right, you need to slow down a bit, or whatever. And we kind of, I think, accept that if we're learning to drive, because we need to. And I know there's a safety aspect. But in counselling, actually, there's an emotional safety aspect. So we do need to know that what we're doing is safe, and we need somebody to tell us and give us feedback on whether we're safe.
Indeed, and I think it hits on something I certainly learned when I did my teacher training. There's a guy called Jeff Petty, who is a well-known professor of teacher training and pedagogy, which is the kind of techniques one uses to teach. And he said that feedback should be task-centred, not ego-centred. So, in other words, not saying to someone, "Oh, you're really great," and "Oh, you're fantastic," but more about giving a more informative view of what's happened. Like, well, you use this skill very well, and this is what happened. Because, of course, if one gives ego-centered praise, then when you have to give ego-centered feedback, then you have to give feedback again, which may not be so great. The person's ego's kind of damaged. So I think that's something that I certainly learned as a teacher, and I tried to practice when I was giving feedback.
Yeah, absolutely right. The feedback should be constructive and helpful in that it helps the learning process of the person that you're giving feedback to, so that it's something to do with the way they've performed, not who they are, because they can't necessarily change things about themselves, but they can change how they perform, how they behave, how they use their skills. And those are the bits that we would want to give feedback on, so that somebody can then look at those things and improve what they do for themselves, and also in order to be more helpful to the helpee or the client that they might be working with. And I think it's important to say that it is a skill, the same as other skills that we learn on counselling training. It is a skill of giving feedback. And there's a certain amount of skill in receiving feedback graciously and not arguing against every point. I would say to my students, just listen to it. Listen to what's there. If you're not sure of something, ask questions about it. Don't just argue back and say, no, I didn't do that, because that's actually not very helpful. It is, after all, someone else's point of view, so you can disagree with them, but you don't need to fall out about it. But actually go away and think about it and think, was it like that? Are they right? Or is there a little grain of truth in there somewhere? Or are they absolutely wrong and didn't see anything in it? Perhaps they were having a bad day, so I'll just forget about it. Yes. It's that kind of process rather than immediately jumping back and saying, no, I wasn't like that. I didn't do that.
Yes, and I think also there's something about, the cumulative effects of feedback. If one person gives you feedback, you can go away and, as you say, well, maybe they're having a bad day, or, maybe they were wrong. But it's always useful, as you say, to think, is there a grain of truth in that? But if you're having a lot of people giving you the same form of feedback, then it's possibly that what they're seeing is the reality of the situation, as opposed to just a one-off opinion.
And the good thing about counselling training groups is that the person who has been your client or your helpee is always sitting there in the room. So you can also check out with them, how did that feel for you when I said this or when I did that? So you can actually get that person's point of view as well. I mean, they might say something like, well, it probably wasn't great to ask a closed question there, but actually it led me to talk about this and it was okay. And you get feedback in that way, which is good. So that, I think it is important to think it's a skill. I've got to learn how to give feedback. I've got to learn how to receive it in the best way so that I am learning and not just dismissing it.
Absolutely. And I think that feedback is how we develop. There's a very famous story of Thomas Edison. Allegedly, it might be an apocryphal story, this, but he was asked what was it like to be the man who failed to make 1,000 light bulbs. And he said, I didn't fail to make 1,000 light bulbs. I know 1,000 ways of not being able to make a light bulb.
Yes.
And I think I think there's something about how the feedback is given, and from the person who's giving the feedback's perception, helping that person to grow, as opposed to being a criticism, using it as a helping hand to help someone develop their skills, their repertoire of skills.
Yes, and it's very much a balance, isn't it, between helping that person to learn so they have sufficient feedback to learn from, which is meaningful, as opposed to just an odd word, as you started off by saying. If somebody just says, well, that was good, well, you might initially think, oh, okay, oh, great, that was good, that's nice. But then you haven't really learned anything. And if you've just done a 10-minute session or a half-hour session and somebody says, that's good, well, then you might be thinking, well, was it all good? Were there some aspects that were better than others? Actually, I need to know a little bit more. That's not terribly helpful. And so it's that balance between saying enough but not being too critical.
Absolutely. And I think it also helps if when I used to teach, we used to have a feedback form which covered the areas where feedback was expected to be given. And that was a useful guide, so the students told me, to be able to look at the feedback without actually knowing what feedback you should be giving. It can be kind of difficult, can't it?
Yes.
So there should be some kind of a template or some kind of idea, running order, if you like, of what areas are being asked on feedback for.
And I think most training courses would have some kind of feedback form for the observer to fill in. It might be quite simple, like beginnings, middles and ends, or it might have a specific skills section to it, or it might concentrate a bit more on the beginnings. And I usually say to students, actually, you can ask for the feedback that you want. So if you know, for example, that you get sucked into asking a series of closed questions, you can say to your observer, can you particularly watch out for me whether I ask questions and if they're open or closed questions? Sometimes that's quite useful to ask for what you want, because you know what your developmental points are.
Indeed, and that reinforces the point of having the feedback you've received with you, so that you can inform the observer who might be a new observer. It may be someone you've not worked with before, and you can say, on my last observation, they picked up on this. Could you keep an eye out for this? Because this is what I've been working on.
Well, That's right. And it's useful to use those written feedbacks as part of maybe a learning journal, learning review, to actually reflect on, this is the feedback that I've been given. Do I think this is valid? Do I think that's really what happened? And like you were saying, oh, well, actually, this is the first person to say this, so I'm going to watch out for that again. Or, oh dear, I've got 6 sheets here that all say the same thing, so maybe there is something in this. What am I going to do about it? Make a plan. So it's very useful to have the written feedback as well as verbal feedback that might be from your peers or your tutor.
So as we come to the end of this, the clear message is don't be afraid of feedback. Make sure that it's constructive. Ask for your feedback you want. And as always, as someone once said to me, feedback is the breakfast of champions. And I think that's a good analogy to leave it at, a good axiom to leave it at. Heather,
very good.
Heather, thank you.
Check-in with CPCAB is proudly sponsored by CPCAB, the only awarding body run by counsellors for counsellors. To learn more about CPCAB qualifications and to get more detailed information on today's podcast topic, visit cpcab.co.uk.
Well, there you have it, Ken. There's nothing at all to be afraid of feedback, as long as it's done correctly, with with a positive spin on it, and done in a structured way. You can see just by what Heather's outlined that it can be just so useful for developing your practice and just helping you move on into professional life.
100%. And I think there's a hindrance in not receiving feedback. And I guess once you've qualified, once you're out there and you're in practice, you may get feedback from your supervisor, and that's part of a supervisor's job, but you're less likely to get the peer feedback, the tutor feedback that you get while studying. So just once again, studying is the golden time. It's when you can really apply that learning and get that critical feedback. Moving on to our third topic today, and that is theory in the therapy room, Rory. Now, there's a saying that kind of you sit in the class and you learn all this theory for all of these years, but at the end of the day, when that door closes, it is that client in front of you, and it's you and them. It's that relationship, and it's the skills that you use. So I guess the question is, where is the place? Where does theory fit in the actual therapy room during a session?
Well, it's an interesting discussion, and it's one I had with a colleague on our Facebook group, and we both agreed to disagree. I think there is a place for theory in the therapy room, but let me tell you the background. If you go to the real beginnings of history, Sigmund Freud, he was analysing clients. He would have his client on a sofa, on a chaise lounge. He would be sitting writing notes. The client would be free associating, talking about anything that came into their heads. And what he would be doing is he would be making assessments and saying, well, this is because you've got a difficulty with your father, or there's some transference, or there's an Oedipal idea here. He wouldn't be getting involved in the relationship, and he'd be making vague kind of observations. And of course, therapy has moved on. They don't even do that in psychoanalysis now. Modern psychoanalysis wouldn't work in the same way Freud did it. But in person-centered therapy, the therapist actually gets involved with the client. It's an I-thou relationship. It's one where the therapist is trying to see the world through the client's eyes, not analyse, not kind of interpret. However, there are times when if you're working with somebody and the client says, for instance, I'm really not sure I should say this because, you kind of scare me a bit because you remind me of my father. That's transference. And unless that comes into mind, you cannot work with it. And and the way to work with that, of course, is to say, okay, I hear that, and I remind you of your father, but actually, I'm not your father, I'm your therapist. I'm a different person. And to talk about it, and even Rogers acknowledged, transference. He said, they don't use it in the same way as psychoanalysts do. The other thing is, if you're working with a client and they're talking about things like how their family has influenced the way they are and having to do as their family said, those are introjected values. That is just a knowledge of that is going to influence how you reflect back to the clients, almost like saying, it sounds like your family and pleasing your family is more important than pleasing yourself. So there is a place for it, but as I say, and I think probably it's very difficult to communicate on a Facebook page. In modern therapy, you have to have an understanding of theory to be able to work with the client and inform your responses.
Yeah, it is an interesting topic, and it's modality dependent, I guess. If you're practicing transactional analysis, you're going to be going in armed with theory. It is a taught model. You're going to be empowering the client by teaching them the theory. The same if you're working in cognitive behavioral therapy, you're going to be working the same way in empowering the client of why they feel this way, why they think this way, what they can do to change. In person-centered theory, it is more subtle, as you say, Rory, and you're in there, you've got that unconditional positive regard, or those core conditions as they kind of outline, where you are viewing that client as non-judgmental, you're fully integrated within that relationship. And the relationship is vitally important. You're using your counseling skills within that. But the material that is coming your way is based in personality theory. Carl Rogers wrote extensively about personality theory. He wrote about the 7 stages of process, which kind of indicates where a client may be in therapy. He wrote about, a lot of theory. So we need to understand what the theory is, to be able to understand where the client is coming from. Yes, we're going to be working in a person-centered way, using the skills, being totally empathic, but without the theory, you're missing a piece in that jigsaw puzzle. You used a great example, Rory, when you're talking about those introjected values. Difficult to say that for me, especially with a cold. Introjected values. It's kind of an introjected value is when a value of another person, maybe your family or a caregiver, is kind of, you take it on as your own truth. You adopt that as your truth because they said it or because they acted in that way, but it isn't your truth. It is introjected. It's kind of slotted into who you are. And if you're working with that person in therapy, you see that come up as a presentation. As you quite rightly said, Rory, you're able to challenge that. But if you don't know what an introjected value is, you don't know what it looks like, you wouldn't be able to do that. You wouldn't be able to distinguish it or detangle it from who that person is. So I think theory is absolutely vital. I feel that theory in person-centered therapy is an unconscious process, or a subconscious process, or it's almost like unconscious competence, where it doesn't have to, you're not sitting there weighing up going, ooh, I wonder which one of the theories this matches into. You kind of have the theory in the background, and Carl Rogers speaks about a way of being. Once you have that theory down pat, and boy, do you write about it enough while you're training, it's there and it's on tap, and it should be subconscious competence, really, just there and available to you.
Totally agree, Ken. And the thing is that, if theory isn't important to us as therapists when working with clients, and you make a good point of saying that some theories are more prominent in the therapy room than others. Transactional analysis, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy, 2 great examples where they're taught models. But if we don't have a reference to theory as practitioners, then why do we train? Why do we train at all? If we cannot use the theory to underpin our intervention and our way of working with the client, what is the point of training? And I do think that you're absolutely right, Ken. There's a big difference between putting the theory as a barrier between you and the client, and seeing the client just in terms of theory. That's wrong. We're seeing the client as a real, vibrant, living person. We're trying to build that kind of person-to-person relationship with them. But we put it in the background. So, just for practical reasons, if you're writing a case study, you're going to have to think about what your client has said. But also, to understand how the theory links to where the client is. I think it's unavoidable, but I dare say there will be people who disagree with me.
Yeah, and I guess that the people that disagree with you will have learned that theory and will have it running in the background anyway. And theory doesn't just apply to the modality that you're using. It's the theory of practice as well. So, for instance, if you're coming up to an ending, you may be coming up to a festive break like Christmas or something like that. How do you work with that client? How do you introduce that? How do you kind of prepare them for that? it's a theory. It's kind of a way of working. It's learnt stuff. It's not just part of a conversation you're having with them. It's not just about using those counselling skills. You're drawing on education and bringing it in as part of your your session. And as you quite rightly said, Rory, taking transference. Transference is often unseen by us. But we can see it maybe in a client, or we may pick that up when we go into supervision. But having an understanding of that theory is absolutely vital. Our attachment style. Who are we? What is our attachment style? What is the attachment style of this client that sits in front of me? All of those things enrich the therapeutic interaction. They make it richer. The theory is not for us to understand the client. The theory is in service of the client. So not having that theory, I guess for me, it just feels like, maybe I'm in the same camp as you here, Rory, but it makes me feel like there's a piece missing from that. And, and we've also recognize that you do the studies, and those qualified practitioners that listen to our podcast, we're very grateful that you tune in. We recognize that after studies, we don't come across the theory that often anymore. We're no longer asked to write an assignment on the 19 propositions and explain what they are, or work through the stages of process. And the theory can maybe fade. And it was one of the main reasons that Rory and I, this is kind of letting the cat out of the bag, Rory, a little bit early. So we always like to give sneak peeks to those of you who listen to our podcast. Rory and I will be launching in January of 2020, we'll be launching a new side to Counselling Tutor for qualified practitioners. And it'll be very much CPD based, where you can look at various presentations, but it's also going to be practice based, where you can dip into the theory again. You can go re-look at those theories and have a look at them again. Deliberate practice, looking at the areas that you feel may be fading for you, because we know that there is a need for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, anybody who may be going for maybe accreditation or anything like that will almost certainly have to, discuss theory and, outline how they practice. I've recently helped someone with their accreditation, and part of that process was to talk about the theory that they used. Well, I'll tell you what, this has been, I think, a really interesting podcast. We started off talking about the personal limitations of PCT. Our good friend Heather at CPCAB talked about the value of constructive feedback, and we finished with a really good discussion topic. How do we use theory in the therapy room? So, as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.